Hi, I'm Heather Robertson from Katy Sue Designs and welcome to my home studio. Today I'll be teaching you how to paint simple faces using miniature heads cast from the Katy Sue Designs head and arms silicone mould set. The simple methods I'll be teaching are based on techniques developed by company founder Sue during the early years of the business when she, together with her mum, began their miniature dolls business. Painting faces can take a lot of practice, so what we recommend before you go anywhere near your finished project, make a whole bunch of practice pieces. Now these faces don't have to be perfect. Over here I'm using some hearty soft white mixed with a little bit of orange just to get a pale neutral flesh tone. And make probably a minimum of 12 of these, just so that you can make them, pop them on some paper towel, leave them to dry overnight, so that you can learn without the fear of making mistakes. You can practice on a whole bunch of different pieces. If you make a mistake, you can just discard one, pick another one up and try again. So this is, it's good to practice with quite a few. I think I've probably made well over 50 heads now while learning to paint them, and I'm pleased to say I'm starting to get quite consistent results now because I've been practicing. So get those heads made, let them dry, and then let's learn to paint some faces together. Before we begin with painting the eyes, we need to add a little bit of warmth to our characters' faces, and to do this I'm going to be using some eyeshadow or blusher palettes. You can also use chalk pastels for this, but you want to have a colour that's in a nice rosy tone, just to give that little bit of warmth to our characters' faces. So let's take one of our plain faces. You're also going to need a little makeup sponge. I'm using an eyeshadow brush here, something with a sponge tip, just to help give you that easy blending. So just take a tiny little bit of your blusher. You won't need very much of this. And then let's place this onto the cheeks and the forehead of your face. Now I'm not blending this in just yet because we don't want our character to look sunburnt. I'm just going to rub all the excess off on my hand there, so that the brush is nice and clean, and then just the colour that we've attached or applied to the face, we're going to blend this into the face. And it doesn't need much. You can put a little bit on the nose and the chin as well if you wanted to, but it really doesn't need much at all. So you're just doing the tips of the cheeks and the forehead, and if there's a little bit left, just do the nose as well. Let's just do one more. So just a little dab of colour. Pop that onto the cheeks and the forehead. Rub off the excess and then just blend that in nice and soft, just to give it a little bit of warmth. Now, if you do put too much on, so let me just go in with a colour that's a bit brighter, and let's say I put that on and it's just too much. There's too much colour there. He looks a little bit sunburnt. You can just go in with a soft tissue or paper towel and knock some of that back. And this is why we're doing this before we've painted the eyes on or done any of the other facial features. We can knock that powder back and make this look much softer, but we're still having that warmth. And now that our faces are have a bit of colour, we can start adding the details to the faces, starting with the eyes. I'm going to show you two different techniques for painting the irises, one with a paintbrush and one with a dotting tool. Either of these techniques can be used with watercolour paints or acrylic paints. So the tools you'll need are your watercolour paints and or your acrylic paint. A very fine tipped paintbrush. I'm using a size 000 or 3/0, that means 3 zeros, which is a really fine tipped round brush. Then we've got a bigger round brush for mixing our paint. You don't want to be mixing your paint with your very fine tip paintbrush because you want to keep that tip lovely and fine. Then I've got a dotting tool, and this dotting tool has quite a small end on one side and a really, really fine tip on the other. And I've also got some cotton buds or Q-tips for helping clean up any mistakes as we practice, some paper towel to dry our brush, some clean water to clean our brushes, and of course the faces that we're going to be painting. So the first thing you need to do is make sure, if you're using watercolour paints, to activate your watercolours. So I'm just going to spray some water onto my watercolour palette just to start getting that paint movable and nice and wet. And I'm going to move my acrylic paint to one side for now. And I'm going to show you the paintbrush method first. First thing you want to do is make sure that your paint is lovely and wet. I'm using a cerulean blue, which is a medium blue for this. And don't use it straight from your paint pan. Put this onto your paint palette. Reason being, this way you can control how much water is in your paint. It will also dry much faster, so if you've put too much water in there, the water will evaporate pretty quickly, and you can constantly just keep adding more water or more paint into this mix until you get the consistency that you like, that you want. Then, and this is why you don't want to be using your fine tip paintbrush for this, because as you're moving this paint around, you don't want to be damaging that lovely fine tip of your paintbrush. Then give your paintbrush a rinse. Don't leave your paintbrush in the water, and I roll and pull my paintbrush down to maintain that lovely fine tip on my paintbrush. We should be finished with that big one now. Now I can go into my small paintbrush. So wet your paintbrush and then make sure all the excess water is off your brush. And let's just check the paint consistency here. It needs to be flowing but not too wet. And I just want to get a tiny little bit on my paintbrush, just so that we can get this moving on our face. Now, before we put the paint on the face, if you can imagine this is the eye, we're not going to be putting the paint in the middle over there. We're going to be putting the paint slightly above the middle, in between the top of the eye, and then we're just going to move this paint around like that. We're not painting a circle, we're just moving it round, just to give you an idea. So let's just get some more paint on our paintbrush. Not too much, not too little. Let's just get that in focus. Here we go. And then I'm just going to put that paint. So just put a little dot there, not quite, it's just a little bit above the center. And I'm just going to move that paint round to get that iris painted. Being careful not to put too much paint in that area, because you don't want it to suddenly flow where you don't want it to go. Then take a little bit more paint and go in on the other side. So let's bring that back to the center so you can see. And I'm moving left and right, up and down, not painting a circle. I'm just moving the paint, pushing the paint until they're both roughly the same size. And if you need to hold your breath to keep your hand steadier, just remember to breathe once you've moved the paint. So hold your breath, move the paint, take a breath. Then clean off your paintbrush and take off that excess water, because the last thing you want to do now is drop some water onto the eye and move all this paint. And we're going to start picking some of this paint back up. So go into the center and up slightly, lifting the paint and wiping it on your paper towel. Same on the other side, just lifting some of that paint off. Wipe it on your paper towel, lift a bit more off. And as you can see, you've now been left with a darker outer circle and it's lighter on the inside. So, and then don't forget to clean off your brush again. Roll and pull the paintbrush so you're still left with that lovely fine tip. Put that head to one side to dry and make sure that this is dry before you go in adding the pupils. So if you're practicing this technique, practice a whole bunch of these with all the heads that you've made, and leave those to dry. Now let's have a look at using the dotting tool. So the dotting tool will give a lovely perfect circle every single time, which is why I love using this. Now it can be used with watercolors and with acrylic paints, but you do need to make sure that your paint is the right consistency. So the dotting tool I have has got a very fine tip on one side, probably one of the finest tips that you can get on one side, and then I've got the next size up, which is a small to medium size tip on the other end. I'm going to be using the larger size of this dotting or embossing tool. And my paint, I want my paint to be a nice creamy flowing consistency. It's not runny, but it's not a heavy set acrylic. And I also want to make sure when I use this dotting tool that the tip isn't completely covered like this. You just want the very tip to have a little bit of paint. So if you've got too much paint on your dotting tool, just wipe that excess off. And we're going to do that every single time we use the paint. We'll wipe off any excess before we go in with the tool. So just dip the very tip of your dotting tool into the paint, so you don't have too much paint on your dotting tool. And you can practice on the back of the head first, just so you can get a feel for what it feels like. These are all practice pieces anyway, so it doesn't matter if you make a mistake. Clean off your dotting tool every single time. Go back in, just take a tiny dot of paint just on the tip, and then press that just above the center of your eye. If you need to press twice, you can, in case you've lifted some paint up. Don't press too hard, just a light, even pressure. And let's clean off our tool. Just the tip. And then just a little above the center. Let's get that in focus. Nice even pressure, not too much. And there you have two even irises. And then just place that to one side to dry. Let's have a look at adding the pupil and the eyelash line. So I'm going to show you this technique again with both watercolors and acrylic paints. And in addition to that, I'm also going to be using a fine liner pen as well, as an option. This is a 0.1, so it's a very, very, very fine tip. So let's have a look at the watercolored method first. I'm going to put the acrylic paint to one side and my paintbrush. And I'm using some black watercolor paint here, but it's a lovely inky consistency. It still flows beautifully, but it's lovely and thick without too much water. So you're going to get a lovely thin, quite opaque, solid black line with this consistency. Make sure that your paintbrush is wet and that all the excess water has been taken off your paintbrush. And what we're going to do with these is, if you have a look at these two faces here, you can see I've not painted the line from tip to tip. It doesn't go from one corner all the way to the other. We're just doing just a little bit beyond the iris on each eye. I've got my black watercolour paint here, and it's a lovely inky consistency. And I'm just going to get some paint onto my paintbrush. So it helps if there is water in the paintbrush first. So if your paintbrush is completely dry, the paint is not going to flow very well. So I've wet the paintbrush is nice and wet and it's holding some water already, and then I can go in and pick up my paint. And I'm going to drop this just a little bit above the center again. Same start position as we had for the irises. And I'm just moving the paint around just a tad, just to get that pupil in. And again, go back in with a little bit more paint and do the same on the other side. Then clean off your brush, wipe off the excess water, and then go back into that paint again. Now, you do need to make sure that you rotate your brush so that you get that lovely fine tip. Put the tip back into that black paint that's on the pupil, and then paint in that line. Now, if you don't have enough, let's just take a bit more paint, add that back into the pupil. Wipe off the excess and use that paint that's on the pupil to create that top eyelash line. Do the same on the other side. Try to do this in one sweep if you can, but you're not going all the way from one side to the other. It's just a little bit beyond the iris on each side. So you do need quite a steady hand for this method. If you don't have a steady enough hand, the next method I'm going to show will be much, much easier. So let's take a different one here, and I'm going to take my dotting tool. And a little bit of black acrylic paint. And with the smaller side of my dotting tool, I'm going to just take a little bit of black paint and press that just above the center. Take a little bit, clean that off, take a little bit more paint, and just a little bit above the center, press that in. Now you do need to wait for this to dry before you move on to the next step. Okay, so that should be lovely and dry now. And now I can come in with my fine liner pen. Just make sure that it writes. And as you can see, that's a very, very fine tip. And basically, we're going to follow the same line that we did with the watercolor paints. And each time I use it, I'm just going to make sure that the ink is still flowing, because it's a very, very fine tip. And the air dry clay is quite spongy and absorbs the ink pretty fast. And again, just draw in that line. And that's a very, very quick, easy way to get that eyelash line if your hand is not too steady with a paintbrush. And of course, you can combine these techniques as well. So if you want to do the same dotting technique on the watercolor and then add add that eyelash line in, you could do that. You could also draw in the pupil with your fine liner pen as well. For the eyebrows, I'm going to be using watercolour paints, and I'm also going to show you the method of using a fine liner. Again, I'm using a 0.1 fine liner pen, so it's extremely fine, and this time I'm going to be using a brown or a sepia colour, which is a brown. So you'll need your fine tip paintbrush. You'll also need your bigger paintbrushes, again, for mixing the paint, and your watercolour palette and some clean water. So let's just add some water onto our palette, and we want to be working with a nice mid-tone brown. So it's not too yellow, not too brown, so kind of a fawn beigey colour. So for this, I've taken some yellow ochre. I'm just going to mix that onto my palette. And I'm also going to take some burnt umber. If you put these two next to each other, then you can blend them together to your desired colour. So if I just take a little bit of that one and a little bit of that one, mix them together until you get the colour that you want. So there we're left with a lovely fawn or beige colour. It's not too dark, not too light. Then just rinse off your brush and put that to one side. Let's take one of our faces. Make sure your brush has been wet. Take off that excess water and make sure there's no excess water on the metal part of your paintbrush again. And then just check the consistency of the paint. Make sure it's not too runny. That might be a little too wet at the moment, so we could let that dry for a bit. Now this over here has been drying for a little bit, so it's a bit thicker. And you can see how it starts to dry, and you can just add water back into that if it starts getting too dry, and that's better. So I just want a little bit on the tip of my brush, and I don't want to be adding too much paint here, because if you add too much, that's just that's just too big. But if you make a mistake like that, not a problem, because it's watercolor. You can just go in and wipe that off with a little bit of water. Be careful not to take it off too much though, because you don't want to disturb all that lovely blush that you added to your face. But I just wanted to show you how easy it is to clean watercolor off if you make a mistake. So just take just the tip of your paintbrush, and we're not drawing big arched eyebrows here. We're just going to add just a hint of an eyebrow, not too high up, so quite low down, kind of on that brow bone there, about there. So I need a bit more paint on my brush. That was virtually nothing. There we go. Just a little line across. Take a little bit more. I'm not going all the way from the corner of the eye to the other side. Kind of almost the same size as the lash line. There you go, just one tiny little line. It doesn't need to be. We're not going for a full. Let me just wipe this off and I'll show you. We're not going to go for a full arch here. Make sure that's dry. So we're not going in for a full arched eyebrow like that. That would make him look a lot older for starters and quite angry. But you can change the character of and the mood of your character by just changing their eyebrows. But for just standard eyebrows, it's just a tickle of paint. So let's, there we go. Just a little tickle of paint to get those eyebrows. Now if you don't have a steady hand, and you're struggling with a paintbrush, again, go in with your fine liner pen. And a brown is much, much softer than black in colour, so you're going to get a much, much nicer, soft look than you would if you were using black. And you might find that you've got a little bit more control over the line that you draw if you're using a fine liner. Again, two different methods, very easy to do. Now, I love using watercolours, as you know, and this is by far the easiest method for me for painting the lips on our characters. And you don't need very much paint at all. Now, on this one, I've used a very soft red, but as you can see, the lips are really, really bright. So if you want a more natural tone, go for a pale brown. And in this instance, I've used a burnt sienna, which is a brown with a slight red tinge to it. On this one here, I've used some cadmium red, which is just a very, very warm red tone. So first of all, we need to get some paint onto our palette, and this needs to be quite thin. We don't want the paint too thick. So I've got some burnt sienna here. On this one, I'm just going to take a little bit of cadmium red. Just pop that on my paint palette, and you can see this is quite a warm orangey. It's quite a warm orangey red, but you really don't need much at all. Rinse off your brush. And your brush needs to be wet, but not completely saturated with paint. So I'm going to go in with our lovely burnt sienna colour, and this is quite diluted, so it's not too thick with colour. And just with the tip of my paintbrush, always with the tip, I'm just going to add a little bit of colour to that bottom lip. Then I'm going to wipe off the paint from my brush and then move that colour around, getting that into the creases on either side. So you don't want too much paint on your paintbrush, otherwise you're just going to end up with a blob. And then you can always just add in a little bit more and gradually build up those layers. So you can go in with some more saturated colour if you want to on the bottom there, or some darker colour, and just slowly build that up and warm up those lips. I'm going to do the same with the cadmium red on this one here. So again, this is a bit of a warmer colour. Just pop a little bit of that red onto that lower lip, and you can see how it's already starting to seep into the crevices there of the mouth. And then just guide the paint along once you've wiped your brush clean, and guide the paint to where you want it to be. Then we can go in and add a little bit more colour if we want to. So you really don't need to paint very much on there to get those lovely warm tones. And already our faces are starting to come to life. But to really bring them to life, we now need to add that little highlight to the eyes. And for this, I'm going to use acrylic paint, and I'm going to use a toothpick or cocktail stick or a pin, sewing pin or needle, whichever you have. Want something with a really, really sharp tip, a really fine point, which is why I like using a sewing needle. And you can just take your raw acrylic paint straight out of the tube and just dip the tip of your needle, just get that into focus, just the tip of your needle into the paint. And then in the top right hand corner, just below the lash line, on the pupil, just add a little dot. Wipe off the pin and then go back in and take a bit more paint. And then do the same thing again on the other side. You want to make sure, on the other eye, you want to make sure that it mirrors what we've just done. or it needs to be on the same side. The highlight needs to be on the right hand side as well, in that same spot. And just go in once, just one little dot. You don't need to go in multiple times, otherwise you may end up with too much paint. And let me show you with a cocktail stick. So I've got quite a sharp point cocktail stick here. I'm just going to take a little bit of white paint. I'll start with the left eye this time. Just pop one little drop there. Wipe off your toothpick or cocktail stick. Go in, get some more paint. And there you have it. Look at those little faces. They immediately come to life and they look like little porcelain dolls. And this is with air dry clay, a little bit of acrylic and watercolour, and you've got some beautiful, simple faces. So practice these techniques, combine them, find what works for you, and practice on multiple heads. And you'll find that it gets easier and easier with practice, and you're going to end up with some beautiful finished pieces.